Welcome to SyrupCast episode 31. I am very excited to be joined by special guest Ben Klass, live from Ottawa. Ben is a graduate student at the University of Carleton. He is also a telecom analyst and the winner of the CRTC's version of The Price is Right. We will get to that in just a moment. But as always, I'm joined by Douglas Soltis, my left-hand man, my right-hand man. My
Yes.
Uptown Funk.
Always left-handed, never sinister.
We are without Jane, who is on vacation, but we are in good company nonetheless. Well, want to welcome Ben. How are you doing, man?
Pretty well. How about you?
I'm great. We had some audio problems last week. I'm like if you're watching the video feed, I'm like bathed in sunlight right now, so I look kind of cherubic. But I assure you, I'm an old man.
Cherubs don't have beards, man.
That's what I said. I'm an old man, nonetheless. So we're gonna sort of talk. We're gonna continue our conversation that we started last week with the CRTC's decision to, I guess, force Bell not to charge by the hour and charge by the megabyte. And this is sort of a victory for Ben personally, because he was the one who filed the complaint with the CRTC back in late 2013. So, in your own words, Ben, tell me about why you're such a terrible person. Why should the Canadian people not be able to watch 5 hours of Bell TV for free?
Well, I am a terrible person. You know, I have this obsession with the idea that our communications system ought to be sort of democratic and subject to fair treatment. And you know, when I noticed what Bell was doing with their mobile TV thing, I thought, well, that's just not on, you know.
So tell me, what was Bell doing? What was the? I mean, basically, they were charging their own mobile TV service in a different way than say a traditional over-the-top service like Netflix, right?
Yeah, I mean, the basic gist of it is that for Bell content, you get it outside the data cap, and for everything else you do on the internet, it's limited. You know, I think the average Bell customer is using something like 1.5 gigs. Is that what George Cope said in the conference call the other day?
Man, you spoiler alert! That you like stole that from me. I was going to say that later in the show.
Okay, it was. I think I got it from one of your tweets, probably actually.
Damn right you
did. Yeah, damn right I did. But I mean, the basic issue here is that Bell's using its pricing of certain different services to, you know, limit what you can do on the internet and to encourage people to watch TV. And for me, the great promise of the internet is being able to choose what you can do with it. Okay, so the typical type of net neutrality things you hear about are throttling, fast lanes, and slow lanes. And in this particular case, we've got a system of preferential pricing.
So if the problem could the problem go away if Bell was just more lenient on their monthly data caps? If, say, I mean, would you have had a problem with it if the Canadian carriers charged $20 for 20 gigs as opposed to $20 for 200 megs? Or is this a matter of any differential or preferential pricing is wrong?
Well, I think that there's two. No, it's discriminatory and preferential pricing. Like when you hear the word discrimination, you're like thinking of all types of nasty things, right? But in price discrimination is something that takes place on a regular basis. Okay, charging different prices for different amounts of data is one form of price discrimination, and it's, I think, generally pretty well accepted. But when you start applying discrimination to content based on who owns it, then you get this problem of editorial control and people making choices about what you can and can't see on the service, right? So if Bell just made the data caps more generous, well, I think absolutely they should do that. The fact that they're offering so much mobile TV for $5 shows that they, you know, quite clearly could be doing this, but are choosing not to. But if they are going to do that, then I think it needs to apply equally to whatever service people choose to use.
So, I mean, I guess the question that I've heard a lot is, and this is sort of Bell's tagline in the whole thing, is they are promoting Canadian content. They have a mandate to do so from the CRTC. Mobile TV is a nascent business, and they have to build it up somehow. They have a bunch of of their own content that they're basically giving away as a freebie to their own customers. When they come back and say, we're just doing what you guys told us to do by promoting Canadian content and making it more freely available, Doug's shaking his head like, no, that's BS.
Yeah, Zach Moore's time out. You know what's mobile TV might be nascent. You know what's not nascent? Mobile watching video content, which is the same as like applying a TV model to mobile doesn't work because everyone on a mobile device sees it as an internet device and just wants access to whatever content that they enjoy. The majority of which is now multimedia content. Like the amount of video that YouTube pushes a month on mobile is like astronomical in terms of like hours and people. So like watching the movies on mobile is not nascent at all.
I think that's a really good point, Doug. And actually, Bell has been offering Bell and Rogers. I think at one point TELUS was as well. Have been offering this type of a service since 2005. Previously it would have been small pixelated screens like on a Palm device, Palm's Trio, or I think Symbian phones, the early Blackberries. But it isn't nascent. And one of the arguments that Bell made throughout the proceeding was that this is just like cable TV. And when you look at cable TV compared to internet use, we don't compare the data caps between those two. You have unlimited cable TV viewing, you have limited internet use. That was one of Bell's main arguments, right? They really said the law doesn't apply. This is, there's a loophole in the law basically that says that you can't stop us from doing this. That was really their main argument. And look at cable TV. And I think you make a really important, important point here is that when people are using their mobile phones, they want to view what they want to view. You want to be able to download what type of app you want to download. It's not cable TV. And to me, to sort of start to impose a cable TV system on the mobile phone is like a retrograde move.
Yeah. So can we go back to because I think the way that you summarize it in terms of editorial control is really nice. I think when we were talking about it last week, we were very much seeing it in terms of the way I was constructing it was as a conflict of interest, where you have the propagator of the infrastructure also controlling content distribution, and then also being the front end like phone provider as well. To step away from the finer points, like Daniel was saying, like, well, what if the data plans were different or structured differently, or there are loopholes in the laws? Is this like an opportunity to step back and say fundamentally the way that we're approaching content or the internet delivery needs to be structured in a different way so it doesn't retrograde to a cable model? Because cable didn't exist before Shaw and Rogers came in to like provide that to the masses. That was delivered with them. The internet was in existence, propagated, developed its own identity and its own relationship to media and consumers well before the major players kind of sought to dictate that relationship specifically with mobile. So how do we take this entrenched kind of like media information empire and like this 21st century model of consuming information on a phone anywhere and make that work? So we're not talking about trees, but we're kind of seeing the forest.
Well, I mean, I think that the thing is vertical integration, right? They call it convergence in telecoms and broadcasting. Well, convergence can be stretched out to mean anything you want, but there's always been a relationship between content ownership and telecoms. So I think the fact that people are watching video on phones these days or watching it on a computer screen and so on is not necessarily the biggest change that's taken place here. It's in the past couple of years we've seen a corporate convergence, right? Bell bought CTV, Shaw Global, Rogers to a lesser extent. You know, there's what is it, Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment, shared between Bell and Rogers.
Well, they also bought the score straight up, right?
Right. So I mean, that's vertical integration along a sort of a different branch of the tree. Mm-hmm. But you've got these big conglomerates, and I think that when they start combining these two things together, there becomes an incentive for them to promote their own particular content, and as well as content that fits within a system. You know, Bell points out that it's like about a quarter of the channels that they own in this mobile TV service belong to Bell, and the rest are Rogers, Shaw, and so on. Mm-hmm. So are they promoting Canadian content? I mean, for the most part, I think yes, they are promoting people to watch Canadian content, but it's content that they've chosen, and I think the discussion we need to be having is who do we want choosing what we see and how we use our communication services. That's the big issue here.
Yeah. And do CanCon rules even apply in an age of like unlimited distribution of content?
Well, I mean, that was the argument that what's it called? Netflix gave at the Let's Talk TV hearings, right? A lot of it had to do with, you know, whether or not Bell should be, or whether Netflix should be required to host Canadian content if they're going to be subject to, you know, Canadian regulatory rules.
Yeah, and then like I think Netflix made such a strong argument of this is the internet, that the CRTC just kind of removed their testimony from the proceedings, right? Like it was almost a recognized. I think it was possibly a little bit due to embarrassment, but also a recognized move that like what Netflix is doing falls outside of the initial conception of what protecting Canadian content is, in a way that like realistically applies to something like the CBC, but not to these over-the-top internet service providers, which is just a la carte present content to people.
Well, I think the thing that they're worried about is that I think absolutely the state should be promoting cultural production in Canada, but the system that they've got for doing it right now has a lot of really bizarre consequences. And I think a lot of it's based on the fact that Canadian content is propped up. You know, there are lots of things. National Film Board, at the end of lots of TV shows, you see this was supported by government of Quebec is a big one you see, or filmed in the city of Toronto, and so on and so forth, right? So there's lots of sort of subsidies that go towards cultural production. But a big part of it, I think, is that the distribution is taxed to produce content, right? This is the Canadian content, the contribution regime, and there's a Canadian Media Fund and so on. And so the revenue from distribution, from cable, is so great, they take a chunk of it and it funds the Canadian content. So you've got like an industry that's more or less addicted to a cable system, right? And the problem that you get
sorry to interrupt, but like to a certain extent, it's not even funding Canadian content. It's funding the creation of content in Canada. Because the Canadian regulations make it so that all this American, like, you know, just the other day, the new Beauty and the Beast CW show launched, and it was filmed in Toronto, right down the street from me. I actually happened to walk into one of their shots accidentally like 2 months ago. That's not, like the lead actress is from BC, I think, but that's not Canadian content. But they're getting all of the tax breaks or the funding towards it. So
I think that's different, right? I don't think that kind of show, because it's owned by an American network, would that cover?
No. Because so the way, like, just in terms of the way that CanCon happens is like there's a series of points that you have. So if it's where it's filmed, if you have a lead actor or actress being Canadian, director or producer, all these things, it doesn't matter who the initial network is. And in fact, if you go to a lot of, like, watching the credits of a lot of films produced, you'll see that a lot of times, without even knowing, it's like a joint Film Board of Canada and like Film Board of Ireland relationship. Right. Those are all done for the tax breaks. It doesn't have to be like the network doesn't. It's not the pure deciding factor. There's if they can check off enough of the boxes, which is, you know, why filming happens here, in addition to the cheaper wage labor, it's a huge revenue kickback for them.
But you see, they can't get this money from the internet because of a 2012 Supreme Court decision that said the transmission of signals by a Canadian carrier is not broadcasting itself. So with the things like Netflix, what they're worried about is the cable revenue, like charging for cable TV and charging for internet service is kind of like double dipping. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, they're providing you with content and carriage for the cable and carriage. So the more things move onto the internet, more people will be able to access these types of programs without contributing to the specific regulatory regime that's been set up to fund the Amazing Race Canada and American Idol Canada. Top
a couple
Chef
Dragon's
Canada.
Dens, new Dragon's Den just launched.
So there you go. Yeah, I think that's a big part of why this Netflix is really sort of threatening these companies, and they show up before the CRTC, and it's a big mess. Nobody knows what to do. They're talking about, is this company even actually legally under the jurisdiction of the Broadcasting Act or not?
So Ben, what happens in 10 years from now? The cable infrastructure is not going anywhere, and I think the ratings from the Super Bowl, the highest televised television show ever last Sunday, is evidence that at least the need for broadcast television or the demand for that kind of viewing is not going anywhere. But what happens when the majority of millennials don't have a cable package anymore, when they become parents and instead of buying their kids access to Rogers or Bell TV, they're just showing all of, and I have friends like this now who have kids who instead of buying television packages for their kids to watch Teletubbies on CBC in the morning, they're just using Netflix to do that. And what happens in 10 years where if the regulatory system is in place where over-the-air signals are still freely available for the core channels and the rest of the content is fairly accessible on the internet, do people stop buying into that cable infrastructure, and do they, what does Bell and what do Rogers do to sort of save their asses in that regard?
Well, I think Bell and Rogers are in slightly different situations, and let's take Shaw as an example, actually, because what happens when people stop paying for cable? They're not going to stop watching. Let's call it television programming, video content, I guess is a better way of putting it, because television comes with all these strings attached. You're not going to get everyone in the country setting up a rabbit ear on their house. I often ask the students, who in here has a cable TV subscription? And you occasionally get one person raising their hand talking about I'm a diehard hockey fan or something, right? Everybody raises their hand when you ask who has the internet.
Everybody.
So you see companies like Shaw, who started their business off as cable, losing subscribers, talking about, oh my goodness, the sky is falling, how are we ever going to make up our revenue, raising the rates on their internet. Right?
Yeah.
It's a common cost base. Their broadcast, when you look at these financial reports, what you see is that the cable TV operation and the internet operation is the same company. They don't report the numbers separately. It can actually be really frustrating because some of the companies don't even report the difference between subscribers of their TV service or revenues from the TV service and revenues from the ISP service in their financial reports.
Yeah.
Right? So if
they want to see them as multiple touch point customers, right? They don't want to just see them as one customer. They want to see them as, and for good reason too. When you're trying to profile out the Canadian populace in terms of how you approach to sell them services, you're trying to plug them in as many as possible.
For sure, and it's all about ARPU for these guys. They want to show that the number is going up, and so if you get someone buying a cable service and an internet service at the same time, it's more revenue. Mm-hmm. So Shaw worries that people are dropping out of the cable system. They're losing. Shaw's lost a fair amount of cable TV subscribers. They're making up for it on the internet side, but internet, I think, right now as it stands, is quite a bit cheaper than cable. Right. So
that's how they. I mean, the caps are what they use to differentiate that. So I'm looking at the Rogers internet packages right now. Yes, the core internet package you can get. I mean, the cheapest Rogers internet package in Ontario is $55 a month, and that's for 10 megabits down, 1 megabit up, and 25 gigabytes of data. And that's really not that. That's not cheap. I wouldn't call that cheap at all. Actually, I'd call that very expensive. I think the more realistic one is the $73 a month package, which gives you 60 megabits down, 10 megabits up, and 120 gigabytes of data.
Which is probably the one that they actually want you to buy. But
yeah.
So no, but going back, so Daniel, to answer your question, in terms of the 10-year protectionism, they've already done it. They bought the sports channels, which is the one thing that the mass populace will will purchase for access to in whatever format it's offered. And then they bought the sports teams to prevent those teams from creating their own content channels, their own Netflix of sports, similar to what has happened in the United States with Brooklyn, the Knicks, the New England Sports Network becoming their own content channels. So they have to be partners with Sportsnet and TSN. Like that's the 10-year plan. They hold on to the thing that is appointment viewing still.
Right, but those licenses expire, and so when Bell buys license,
Daniel, they own the sports teams. It doesn't matter if the license to broadcast NHL, NBA, or whatever. They own the teams and they own the sports channels.
Sorry, no, I know what you're saying in terms of like the Raptors and the Leafs. They're jointly owned by Rogers and Bell. But when you're talking about the New England Patriots
and the Blue Jays and the Habs.
Right. Sorry. I mean, I'm talking specifically about, say, Bell licensing the NFL. Mm-hmm. NFL's, or Rogers buying the rights to the NHL for 12 years, right? These are packages that expire that eventually, if the demand is high enough, Bell or Shaw or both of them are going to come together in 12 years and say, we don't want Rogers to get this back. They made a ton of money from this. We're going to up the bid to $12 billion or whatever. That's what the NHL wants.
Yeah, but Daniel, but that's as long as one of the cable providers has it. The NHL is happy to do that. The thing that would really scare them is if they went and said the NHL was like, we're just going to do this ourselves and broadcast it, which they wouldn't do because then they have to become a media entity and a broadcaster, and they wouldn't make as much money as just signing a big just distribution package with one of these cable carriers.
Sorry, the GameCenter service for NHL this is just basically an add-on, because I know NHL was doing that themselves previously, right?
Yes.
Well, they do in the U.S. They have their own distribution rights in the U.S. It's just that in Canada they partnered with Rogers to avoid having to build that infrastructure, as far as I know.
Yeah, but so I guess what I'm saying is this structure, no matter who wins the bid for the content, which can go back and forth every 5 or 10 years, things won't change until someone like the NHL or say the NBA says we're going to partner with someone like Netflix that everyone can access purely through the internet to get this, where you don't need to be tied into a cable box. That's the only way it would change, and that's not going to happen until someone like a Netflix or another just digital-only service provider can offer up the billions of dollars to own the rights. And even then, it's unlikely to happen because the cable providers own the teams. Like, they have an access point into the league voting, which decides who wins the bid. Like,
so
that's...
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think it's as concentrated in the U.S. as it is in Canada. I think it's an extraordinary fact that the broadcasters, the vertically integrated companies that own the distribution and the content, also own the teams themselves.
Canada, the Media Concentration Research Project I work for here at Carleton, has got a lot of data on this, and I think by most measures you can say it's safe to say that Canada's vertical integration, the extent of vertical integration in this particular country, is greater than virtually anywhere else. The States has a pretty concentrated media market, but it's nowhere near what we have, and nowhere near the vertical integration either, from bottom to top, like you're talking about sports teams being owned by the same company who owns the broadcaster, by the same company who owns the cable TV company, right? Same company who, I don't know, sells you hockey sticks probably.
Yeah, and I think, going back to the GameCenter product in the U.S., I think that is owned by the NHL. I think that they control the distribution rights. They own the content, and I think that Rogers paid so much money not just for the distribution rights, but so that they could own the piece of the stack that is so important to them. They own the content in Canada, so they set the blackout rules. The fact that they're using it the same way that they're using Show Me, right, as a value add to their core cable package. So
as a value add, but then also a lock into the core cable package. Right?
Yeah, I think that's important because let me do my best impression of Kevin O'Leary here, okay?
Go for it.
I think content providers and distributors getting together is insane. I mean, it's just crazy, man. What are these people thinking? As a shareholder, as an investor, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I'm not a shareholder or an investor, but they're doing more work here. $5.2 billion coming out of Rogers' pocket, going into the NHL pocket, right? And that's over 12 years, right? So, I don't know, $200 million a year, something like that? No, it's way more than that.
Not chump change.
On the fly math skills here, not so good. But in any case, the margin for providing connectivity and content is much lower than it is for just providing the connectivity. Okay, so they're doing a whole bunch of work and they're spending a whole bunch of money, and the thing is that it's uncertain. The demand for connectivity, plain and simple, in 10 years, I think it's very safe to say that it's going to be greater than it is right now. Okay, I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. Advertising, however, right, and advertising-supported media, like hockey, is subject to every passing wind in an unstable globalized market, or however you want to call it, right? So Rogers betting on hockey, I mean, if there is something you're going to bet on, that's going to be it. But to me, I think
it's more stable than the Canadian currency is interest in hockey.
Right at this particular moment. But
it's like that maple syrup speculation, which is actually a thing, which I learned and blows my mind. But okay, so then can we talk about, because Daniel and I also went back and forth on the idea of, say, a company like Rogers being, because Rogers' results weren't as spectacular as Bell's in the sense where they are making more money per customer, but still bleeding customers. Is it possible for a service provider, despite the multitude of services, to be a high-end provider in the way that, say, an Apple is a high-end consumer electronics provider? Because that's what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to stick to what they see as value-added services, and we see as lock-in, as a way to be more than a dumb pipe utility. But the volatility of that is circumspect compared to Apple being able to produce, quality builds, quality components, the physical value of holding like a well-built thing in your hand. Like what's the value of a well-built service?
A well-built network, not a service. Rogers doesn't provide a service. They provide a network and they build services on top of that network. I mean, that's really what the Title II stuff in the U.S. is all about, right? It's differentiating between the companies that build the infrastructure and the companies that build on top of the infrastructure.
But Daniel, everybody goes and buys an Apple product because they want the phone, they want the tablet, they want the watch. No one goes to Rogers to buy the network.
I don't think that's true.
To be fair, that's what you're getting. I don't think the comparison between Apple, I mean, there's lots of problems in making these types of comparisons and metaphors, right? Yes. These companies produce infrastructure. That's what they do. So when someone goes to Rogers, Rogers is reselling them a phone, and the Rogers is just an example because the business model is the same for all the companies. They resell a phone, and they sell you access to infrastructure. It's like paying a toll to get on the highway. That's what you're getting from these companies. Mm-hmm. And I think what what they do, and I think the Canadian carriers. It's hard. It's hard to say this with any degree of generality because it's different from place to place, right? I have an MTS phone. I'm living in Ottawa right now, so I'm on roaming on Rogers network. I'm grandfathered on unlimited Canada data, so $65 a month. Eat your hearts out the rest of Canada, but it works. It works pretty good for me, and I've been consistently impressed with the data speed, the coverage, and so on. So for a mobile carrier, what they've got to do is provide a seamless experience, right? The coverage needs to be there when you need it, and it needs to be fast enough to load web pages and so on. Peak period is the key thing for wired infrastructure.
Right. That's not really an issue anymore. It used to be more so, but I think the bandwidth is there, and the technology, the DOCSIS technology there, is evolved enough that I don't think people have to worry about getting, their speeds dropping to 1 or 2 megabits at peak times like it used to.
Well, I think plenty of people are worried about that. This Shaw TPIA raise, one of the possible explanations for it is that they've been advertising prices that they just can't meet.
Is that a permanent thing, or you're talking about? I know that TechSavvy and their resellers were unhappy with the price increase, but is it just that Shaw hasn't built up the infrastructure necessary in certain parts of Canada to sustain itself with a wholesale package? Well,
the network has to be built to peak use, and it doesn't matter who your customers are. The period of the day, afternoon. There's a curve that shows it, right? It's like a traffic jam. The 401 would be the best example.
Yeah.
You don't want to have to go to the airport at 5 o'clock on a Friday.
Yeah, and watching any streaming content at 11 o'clock at night is a giant pain.
So the question was, what are these networks providing, and how do they do it well, right? And I think for the wired internet companies, they've got to produce networks that can handle peak traffic, and this becomes more important as people. It's not exactly appointment viewing to watch Netflix, but you're not watching it while you're at work,
So what happens then? And we go back to this whole idea of the cable model being not restricted, right? They don't charge you by the hour. They charge you a monthly fee, and you can watch as much or as little cable as you want. But with the reality of transitioning to cable or wireless content viewing, all of these, and most Canadians, I would guess, don't have unlimited internet at home. And if they do, they're paying a premium. So what happens in 10 years if these restrictions are still in place, and you're watching a hockey game on GameCenter live on Rogers, and it's 2 gigabytes per hour of use, and you can only watch X number of those equivalent types of pieces of content every month. People are going to do at home what they are doing on their mobile phones, which is restricting their usage because the networks that are purporting to give you, and I'm just playing the devil's advocate because that's what I do. But the whole idea of Bell's offering you 5 hours as opposed to a specific amount, or giving you a database restriction, was that they don't want you to worry about going over your data usage, your bandwidth limitation, right? So what happens when people have transitioned over to the same system in their homes and they don't have unlimited internet?
I think this is a conversation that we really need to have. For most of the 20th century, local calling was by design unlimited. There were discussions about introducing metered telephones for home use, charging by the minute, but it doesn't fly, and I think it's because, tell me if you disagree with this, but I think in the collective judgment of society, being able to express yourself and being able to communicate is something that shouldn't really be limited unless there's a really good reason to.
Well, yeah, it's the difference between broadcast and access, right? And I think people can understand, either the pricing structure or the technical impositions on a broadcast model, but we know that digital is an access system. It's a by demand content engagement. But going to this, so in having this conversation, and we've talked about how the corporate bodies are dealing with this, I think we have to talk about then what role is the government playing in regulating this, because they're the one that change. They're the ones that change the conditions on the field. And in the U.S., which is a model that we tend to follow or react to, there was the recent announcement that the FCC is going to approach the internet as a utility, which is amazing and will be fought to the death by many of the traditional broadcast entities and embraced by many of the new 21st century digital agencies. How will that playing out affect how the CRTC approaches like the next 10 years of regulation?
Well, it's the United States is essentially bringing their system into line with what we've got in a watered-down form. Okay, so in Canada, there's never been any question that these companies are Canadian, common carriers, right? It's not exactly utility regulation what they're bringing in, because they forbear, they don't regulate the prices. They let competition handle that. But basically, what the United States is doing is they're bringing their system into line with us, but they're leaving out the aspect where companies like Tech Savvy or Electronic Box, the wholesalers, can have access. So they're not doing the unbundling. But for all the problems we have with our internet service here, the people in the States, and I follow quite a lot of these folks on Twitter, on both sides of the political spectrum, are talking about, oh no, you regulate, this is going to be the end of the world, and so on and so forth. And I always chime in and say, we have the system in Canada. We've got pretty good internet. They've got data caps, but that's related to vertical integration. Have a look up here. It's not so bad. To which they respond, Canada, and scratch their head. Saying,
to which they respond, Canada.
Yeah, it's America's hat, man.
So, I mean, from what I hear in the U.S., a lot of people don't have data caps, or at least when they're on Comcast or these cable providers, they generally get terrible service, and their speeds are not as consistently high as they are here, but they don't usually have data caps built in. They have higher data limits on their mobile devices in the U.S. for the same price or less, and this sort of happened in the last couple of years, where T-Mobile and Sprint have come in and undercut a lot of the incumbents, and as a result, AT&T and Verizon have either decreased their monthly plans or increased the data allotment associated with them, and that's sort of what everybody on MobileSyrup argues needs to happen in the wireless space, and they look to MTS and SaskTel as examples of companies that have forced the incumbents to lower their prices in certain parts of Canada where there is quote-unquote a viable fourth competitor, leaving out the fact that Wind and Mobilicity are not considered viable in Ontario, BC, and Alberta because they really don't have the networks to challenge the incumbents. So, I mean, what do you say to that? Is there a prospect for that happening in Canada? Even the Canadian cable internet rates are not high, are not low. They're high even with wholesale regulation.
Well, I think in my understanding, the Canadian approach has always been a little more restrained when it comes to competition than America. I think you see this sort of. Do you follow John Legere on Twitter?
Oh yeah,
right.
Dude's hilarious.
You don't get that kind of stuff up here, right? But I think that for a long time the regulator's been sort of asleep at the switch on these types of things. I did a study just recently of decisions, regulatory policies, and orders that the CRTC has made, going back to 2000, to do with wireline internet, telephone, and so on and so forth, and very few decisions, almost none in fact, having to do with wireless until the past 2 years. I think Blay has already made nearly as many decisions on wireless as Conrad did in his entire time. So the wireless system for Canada was basically deregulated from the start. And as it's become more important for people, not just business people, but virtually everyone you meet, you're having this sort of appeal to, well, we need more competition, we need more fairness. Verizon never shows up. The competition thing is seeming kind of weak, right? So the CRTC, instead of just doing something like saying regulate the prices, they're currently considering how to regulate in order to promote competition, right? We've got this in both the wireless and the wireline sectors. We've got these pending decisions, these hearings that went on last year, and I think the general drift of what's going on in these things is that we need to act to create an institutional regulatory structure that promotes independent companies, that promotes network sharing, infrastructure sharing, and they don't use these terms, right? They
So
use
to what extent is
wholesale
that
access.
happening?
Sorry?
So to what extent is that happening then?
Well, all the major wireless carriers do some form of network sharing with each other, right? Less so on the wireline. I think the wireline independent ISPs make up a very small, it's less than 10% amount of the national market share. But I mean, we'll have to wait and see what the CRTC says, right? We've got Videotron talking about our expansion, and this spectrum we bought in other provinces is subject to favorable rules from the CRTC. Wind is about to reach 1 million customers. There's talks about a merger. I think it's entirely possible that with the right direction, we could see service improvements, right? Wind in the original hearing that led to the big thing last year. You might remember in 2013 they had this decision where they found roaming was discriminatory. Rogers had locked Wind into exclusive contents and stuff. Wind's basic argument was, this is compromising our fundamental business philosophy. We offer flat rates for voice, flat rates for text, flat rates for internet. So sort of what we were talking about before, the data cap, should people be able to communicate and so on. The terms under which we're forced to negotiate with these companies, right? And all the companies do it. In Manitoba, Rogers is sharing with MTS. In Quebec with Videotron, they're sharing in Northwestern Ontario with Thunder Bay. Bell and TELUS have built their whole network as a sharing thing, right? Mm-hmm. So in terms of the future of regulation and the future of what's going on with these things, to be able to say to a company like Wind, okay, we're going to give you access to the resources that you need to expand this business because it's limited right now. The regulator needs to make some hard choices, and Bell and TELUS obviously aren't going to like it. But I mean, I think that's what they can do, right? Is try and set up a structural situation where competition can actually take hold.
Do you think that the argument that if they regulate domestic roaming rates, the company's revenue will drop to such an extent that they'll be quote unquote forced to stop developing or building infrastructure in rural areas? I mean, is that a red herring, or is that?
Yeah, that's nonsense. The CRTC's monitoring report shows a graph about where all the roaming revenues come from. It's all from the states.
So the roaming revenues that they get from companies like Wind, MTS, Eastlink. I mean, these are all.
They stand to gain substantially from this. Previously Wind was saying, no, customers, you can't, it's $1,000 a gigabyte. That's what it was before. I mean, yeah. give me a break, right? So people weren't using it. The revenue, I have, obviously the numbers are redacted when you go through these regulatory filings on things like that. But Wind, they've launched this ad campaign talking about our Go National or something like that, right? And they've got the grizzly bear and all this. Use your phone in the woods to, I don't know, call your grizzly bear friends and go catch some salmon. But they're encouraging people to now use roaming. And Bell, TELUS, I think TELUS and Rogers are the companies they have agreements with. They make money off of that.
Absolutely, and I mean, if they were to offer, I mean, what's so interesting about Wind's proposal is they want to offer unlimited 3G throughout Canada for a flat fee. similar to what they do in the U.S., and it's cheaper for them to roam on T-Mobile in the U.S., and they currently charge $39 for an unlimited talk, text, and data plan for both the U.S. and Canada. But the data in Canada is limited to their home zones, whereas in the U.S. it's limited to basically wherever T-Mobile's network expands, which is pretty much the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, certainly in the urban centers. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, one only hopes the regulatory. I mean, they changed the law, right? So the rates as it stands right now can't be higher than what the average. I think it's the average retail. Someone's going to be pissed that I said that, the average retail rate. They basically took the revenues for total voice, total text, total data from each of the companies, averaged it together, and divided that by the volume. And so that looks a lot like the average retail rate to me. So when Wind pays for its customer to roam onto, let's say, TELUS, chances are it's paying something in the same amount as what a TELUS customer, on average, would pay to use that data, right? So, I mean, I think that we'll see if it pans out, this type of stuff.
Right now, your a la carte price for 500 megs on Wind to roam on one of its partner networks is $25. So that's exactly the same as what Bell, Rogers, or TELUS charges their prepaid customers for the same amount of data. I think that's sort of become the de facto standard for 500 megs of data in Canada is like $25, which is compared to parts of the UK and certainly, or parts of Europe and certainly in the US on companies like Sprint and T-Mo is much more expensive.
It's a ripoff.
So yeah, we don't have a lot of time left. I want to sort of touch on a couple of things before we go. What are your thoughts on Chatter, Ben? Because I'm not Chatter, sorry, Public Mobile, and TELUS's rebranding of this as a cooperative wireless provider. But more to the point, it's one of the first carriers that's offering data-only LTE plans with a phone number. So they'll give you a phone number, but you won't be able to make phone calls or send text messages. You can just use it.
You do it the prepaid rate.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean the Bell, Rogers, and TELUS have all been offering similar type plans already. They've just called them tablet plans, but you can take the SIM card and stick it into a phone. So I know Dan Meisner has got a blog post up about how he's been doing this for a while.
Yeah.
Right.
Basically, if you have a buddy working at any of the major carriers, you can get it set up pretty easily. I've done it before. It's great.
So yeah. I mean, so that's one way to do it. But you do play. You don't give out the number because if you pay prepaid rates. So like 25 cents a minute for voice and I don't know what it is for the text messages.
Right. Well, the best thing to do is to just set up either auto forwarding or blocking incoming calls to prevent yourself from doing that.
And you can then rely on data-based call and text apps to fill in the blanks.
I mostly do now anyway. FaceTime's taken over my life. I was at the checkout counter of the OnePlus store the other day. Got an invite in the mail. Was about to buy it. Good price. So on. Doesn't have FaceTime. Couldn't do it.
Right. Well, there you go. And eventually, I don't send a lot of text messages today, but if I told everybody with whom I send texts regularly that I want to transition over to, say, WhatsApp or BBM, they would probably be okay with that. I would just have to tell them beforehand.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to get caught text messaging with tumbleweeds.
Exactly, right. And eventually that's going to happen. That's why the transition over to 2-year plans brought unlimited text and unlimited voice, not by accident, because
it'll be interesting to see whether people pick the $10 texting option with the Public Mobile.
Right. Yeah, it will be. I mean, the fact that they charge $10 a month just for the SIM card fee is kind of, I don't know. I mean, sort of.
I think it's punitive. I think it's good to see that they're experimenting with unbundled pricing models. I think that's really important because the phone is an expensive part of it, and essentially what you're doing when you get the subsidized device is taking out a loan that you don't really know the terms, or to which you don't really know the terms, right? And I think that caused a lot of frustration for people. At the end of the day, it's all about, for the company, it's all about getting the ARPU up. But for the customer, you may be paying the same with a finance phone and with an unbundled cell phone plan, but if that unbundled cell phone plan doesn't exist, you're paying for the phone anyway. And I don't know, I said to the CRTC last year, if there's one thing you could fix with the wireless market, I said, well, the price of the phone's hidden up into the service fee and causes all types of problems with cancellations. It makes it look like you're paying a higher monthly bill than what you actually are.
Right.
And what what TELUS is doing, I guess, is testing out to see whether people want these unbundled options. And I think, it's good. Keeping the service price low, the base service price low, they would call it a distribution channel. And I would call it not ignoring customers who aren't buying the newest phone every 6 months, who just want connectivity. And I looked on there. It's still expensive, right? You're talking about $50 a month for 1 gigabyte with unlimited voice, I think.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
Well, I'm curious what you think about sort of the data price scaling in Canada, because it's so non-linear, and I've wanted to talk to you about this for a while, but when you see plans start at 1 gigabyte for $20 and then go up to 4 gigabytes for $50, you wonder, this isn't. They argue that it's that spectrum is a finite resource, and these limitations, these data pools are as a result of their of their sort of network being constrained in many ways. But it's such a nonlinear equation that I'm wondering.
We talked about price discrimination in the beginning, right? This is the type of price discrimination that apparently is acceptable. I don't think it is when you're talking about people paying $10 for 100 megabytes at the low end of the scale. And what was the number we had earlier? It's $20 for 1 gigabyte or something?
25 for 500 megs usually.
Okay. So, at the bottom end of the scale, you've got per unit. If you want to measure the unit as a megabyte or a gigabyte or whatever, I think the real measure should be the baseline price of getting service, but that's a different story. If you want to measure by megabyte, you have people on the bottom end, people who might be struggling to meet their bills, people who are on prepaid and they've got to refill the card every so often and so on, paying the highest rates. So
okay, so going back to this then, because you said with the FCC's regulation or move to push this access, treat it as a utility in the States, you said it was very much basically adopting what is already here in Canada without some of the intrinsic like pricing competition.
Mm-hmm.
But in Canada, we don't treat this stuff as a utility, and just in looking at the way in which the cost of data changes depending on the package plan and things, what if we did that to heat or water in Canada? Like if we approached the cost of water depending upon, like, if you have your water bottle share everything plan, or like your only take showers on Tuesdays, like there would be riots, because for a utility you expect service paid for at like the amount of use, not fluctuating by time of use, type of use, or other elements relating to your pay of that utility service. So if we have a regulatory structure that approaches this as a utility, why is all the pricing and the context of it not as a utility?
Okay, so we need to have two things straight here. These things are utilities, the phone companies, the cable companies, right? They're utilities and they're common carriers, and they don't like this type of language because it implies regulation. But rate regulation, and the reason that some people are saying don't call Chairman Wheeler's plan utility, is because it does come packed in with this idea of onerous regulation, of micromanaging prices, right? For instance, if you want to think about our carriers as regulated utilities, they file tariffs, which means they file for approval for certain types of their services, and the commission grants them permission not to do that in particular cases, right? The cases that they are not regulated for price are things like internet service, right? So your home internet service is not regulated by the choice of the CRTC, and it's not entirely choice. There's a formula that determines when they can and can't make this decision. Cable TV has at times had regulated prices, right? Telephones, most certainly, and when you think about things like the contribution regime for high-cost serving areas. So these things most definitely are utilities, but the idea is that with a certain amount of limited competition, you get pricing discipline and you encourage the carriers to continually update their networks, to experiment with different types of things, but it doesn't completely free them from these social obligations that they have.
But we're always talking about how one carrier makes a move to a certain plan pricing structure, and that's within a month, all the same carriers have the exact same plan structures, or they're turning them on like almost within the same week sometimes. So where I understand the principle of that, but much in that we were saying, hey, Americans, don't worry. It's working fine up here, and they're like, "Oh, Canada, we're like competition, that's not actually there."
Yeah, no, it's a textbook oligopoly, the market in any given geographical area for, in particular, home connections, right? You would never really have more, except for the regulatory system for wholesalers. You wouldn't really ever have more choice in between your local telephone company and your local cable company, right? They say this is competitive, and it does encourage companies to invest, right? But is it suitable to just turn the companies, is having 2 companies or 3 companies, does that impose suitable market discipline to just turn them loose, say price things however you want? That's the question here. It's a loaded question, obviously, because you know what I think the answer is, right?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is, you and I have spoken about this before, Ben. The consolidation of telcos in the UK is not under the same scrutiny as it is in the US, largely because the regulatory environment there has already been established, and it's one of those understood things that once BT buys 3, or is it the other way around? BT buys O2. No.
Everything
3 buys O2. BT was in the running. That things won't drastically change and prices won't overnight skyrocket in the UK as a result, because the regulatory body is already fairly strict there.
Is it because it's strong, or just it has enforced a culture where you do not have them looking to do this? Is it actually letter to the law would prevent them from doing it, or is it just the culture of not gouging or non-collusion, or what is it? What specific part of their regulation prevents the prices from being jacked up? Because I think there's the letter of the law, there's the spirit of the law, and then there's how that affects.
There's the long arm of the law, right?
Yeah, then there's a long arm. When Bell was making the argument against Verizon coming in, whoa, we don't need these non-Canadian foreign entities coming in and doing business in Canada. That's just wrong. And then that's an insane argument, because Bell was that company, but that was also over 100 years ago. So
Verizon only divested of its interest in TELUS in 2004.
So, and AT&T divested their interest in Rogers when?
Yeah, it was around the same time, 2000, I think, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
But and these are, that was AT&T was something like 30% of Rogers Cantel or Rogers Wireless, whatever it was called at the time.
Right.
But no, the rate. I mean, the Ofcom, right, which is Britain's version of CRTC. I think imposes strong conditions when these types of mergers take place, right? So if something moves forward, what I think you'll probably see is Ofcom being very critical and very meticulous in ensuring that the wholesale market for wireless services continues to be open. Okay. Right? So they haven't had to impose the types of things the CRTC is considering imposing right now. I think regulated roaming, but in certain places, like in France, they have. And as a condition of license, you might expect to see a divestiture. You know, okay, you guys can match up together, but you have to spin off maybe some of your sub brands or something like that. You know, you have to commit to continuing to give access to companies, and then you would see something like what Industry Canada set up here at conditions of license on the spectrum auctions. Say you have to commercially negotiate roaming, right? I wouldn't say what they're doing is heavy-handed, but it's what the regulator is supposed to do, right? They need to be agile, and they also need to be looking from a longer, sort of broader view than maybe some the financial community or the management of companies are doing.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll find out whether the CRTC's decision on domestic roaming regulation comes through. When do you expect that decision to come through, Ben?
Well, as I understand it, they're working through the Talk TV stuff right now. And I've heard March for some more decisions on that one.
Okay.
So possibly summertime, I would guess.
Isn't March also the time that the auction for
AWS3?
AWS3.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a busy year in telecoms. Canadian telecoms is going to be real busy.
So we unfortunately have to end our show there. There's a lot of other stuff that I wanted to get to, but maybe we'll have you back in a few weeks to go over this in a bit more detail. I like these sort of semi-regular regulatory chats. But if you want to learn more about Ben Klass and his work, where can they find you, Ben?
I'm on Twitter at Ben Klass. It's a good way to do it. Or I have a website, benklass.wordpress.com.
Got it. And not that they need to look very hard to find you, but Douglas, where can they find you on the web?
At Tron, MobileSyrup.com, thebetakit.com.
Not the BetaKit, just to be clear.
Sorry, yes, betakit.com. Sorry, I got to keep it a little more formal. And then, yeah, wherever you'll find a Raptors game, that's where I'll be.
And I am Daniel Bader at JourneyDan, MobileSyrup.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks so much, Ben. This was really, really great. Thanks for finally making it on, and we'll have you on again soon.
Right on. Well, thanks for having me.
Shoutouts, Manitoba.
Had a good time.
Yeah, and Ottawa.
Jeff Broussard, all is forgiven, buddy.
Yeah, we love you. All right, cheers, guys. Doug, you're using the big mic, right?
What does your microphone look like? Sorry, now I'm worried that my microphone is not looking the way that it should.
No, it's just literally just pointed straight up like a dick in the air.
Yeah, so perpendicular to the ground.
Correct, perpendicular to the ground.
Okay. Instead of parallel to my face. Jesus, goddamn.
Okay, the fuzzy part, the cock part should be pointed straight. Should be straight up in the air.
This is what my mic looks like. If you were hitting record, you would have had a really great shot of me just mowing down on the front of that mic.
We're live right now. So.
All right. Well.